Our gospel lesson comes from the book of Mark, chapter 9, 30 through 37. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for his teachings, his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and he was in the house, and he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last, must be a servant of all." And then he took a little child and put it among them. And taking it into his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but he who sent me." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. I'm going to take just a minute here and get some of my technology ready, because I'm going to try to play you a recording. So 1 second. Sorry, I thought I had it all queued. There we go. I have been pondering this week what it really and truly means to be a servant. Early this week, I heard the recording I'm going to play for you. It was recorded in 1949. And it comes from American public media. The voice you are about to hear belongs to 101-year-old Fountain Hughes. And part of what you are going to hear is his account of his childhood as a slave, and what it meant and what it was like to be set free by Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, just tell me what your name is.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. That's enough.
Who did you work for, Uncle Fountain?
Who did I work for?
Yeah.
You mean when I was a slave?
Yeah, when you were a slave, who did you work for?
Well, I belonged to Burnley's when I was a slave. My mother belonged to Burnley's. But we was all slave children, and soon after, when we found out that we were free, well then we were bound out to different people, and we'd run away and wouldn't stay with them. Well then we'd just go and stay anywhere we could, lay out at night and anywhere. We had no home, you know. We just turned out like a lot of cattle, you know how to turn cattle out in the pasture? Well, after freedom, you know, colored people didn't have nothing. Colored people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. They all slept on the floor. And there were some free-born colored people where they had a little education, but there were very few of them where we was. We was what they call, we were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hog and all like that, have an auction bench, and put you up on the bench and bid on you, the same as bidding on cattle, you know.
Was that in Charlotte that you were a slave? Was that in Charlotte or Charlottesville?
That is in Charlottesville.
Charlottesville, Virginia.
Sell the women, sell the men, all that. You have nothing to do. Time to cut tobacco. If they want you to cut all night long out in the field, you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired. And then if you had any bad ones, you'd sell them to the nigger traders, what they call the nigger traders, and they'd ship them down south and sell them down south. But otherwise, if you were a good person, they wouldn't sell you. But if you were bad, mean, they didn't want to beat you and knock you around, they'd sell you to the what they call a nigger trader.
The interview continues for quite a while. I'm not sure why it has captured my imagination in quite the way that it has. But for me to hear a first-hand account from a slave is fascinating. And at the same time, while I find it fascinating, I'm not sure it's even fair to include this recording in a reflection about what it means to be a servant. Because slavery takes away a person's humanity. Fountain later himself says that if the threat of enslavement returns, he would rather shoot himself than to ever be a slave again. And yet so many people who owned slaves did, in fact, refer to them as servants. And still, the terms slave and servant is common biblical language. The lesson that we heard today from Proverbs was an interpretation I did myself. I spent several hours reading and studying various translations, trying to get to the heart of the Scripture. Why, you ask? Well, in part, like Abraham Lincoln, I felt like the text needed to be freed from its sexist language. The original language suggested a confining stereotype for a woman's worth. The cultural context of the author and our own seemed just a little too disconnected. And while the text sought to praise a good wife, it also entrapped and undermined its own teachings about serving others, the value of serving others. So what does it mean in 2012, almost 2013, to be a servant, to serve the needs of others, not just to be like a butler or a good spouse, but to spiritually and faithfully invest our lives in the servanthood of God's kingdom, a kingdom where we are slaves and yet we are free, a kingdom where the king has died and yet lives. In last week's readings, Jesus used the example of denying oneself as the ultimate model for being in relationship with God and others. In today's lesson, Jesus urges us to put ourselves last and be a servant to others. Jesus then goes on to say that to welcome a child is to welcome him. And children today, though, were nothing like biblical children. Most children didn't live. They were unable to work. Their worth was similar to that of a dog. Welcoming children was an extreme act of hospitality, of breaking the rules. Our primal instincts want us to put ourselves into positions of power so that we are safe from others. However, Jesus is inviting us to evolve beyond our primal instincts and to become vulnerable to one another in order that we might enter into a kingdom where interconnectedness rules, where vulnerability is common, where our labor and our servitude to others are the economy of our community. Let me tell you another story. There was once a church near a very large town that had fallen under hard times. It had once been a grand church. It supported hundreds of programs and missions that stretched across the globe. A large team of pastors had run its grand programs, and they had traveled the world doing God's work. But now, its many buildings that were once filled with faithful people were all but deserted. People no longer came there to be nourished by prayer. They no longer came to worship. They no longer came to serve others. Only a handful of old pastors shuffled through the hallways and empty classrooms, serving God with a heavy heart. On the edge of the church property, there was a very large state forest. Within the forest, an old rabbi had built a small little hut, and he would come there from time to fast and to pray, but no one ever spoke to him. But whenever he would appear, the word would be passed from pastor to pastor. The rabbi walks in the woods. And for as long as he was there, the old pastors would feel sustained and uplifted by his prayerful presence. One day, the senior pastor decided it was time to visit the rabbi and open his heavy heart to him. So after the morning Eucharist, he set out through the woods. As he approached the hut, the pastor saw the rabbi standing in the doorway as if he had been waiting for his arrival. The rabbi's arms were outstretched in welcome, and they embraced like long-lost brothers. The two entered the hut. There in the middle of the room stood a wooden table with the Holy Scriptures open on it. They sat for a moment in the presence of the Holy Book, and then the rabbi began to weep. The pastor could not contain himself. He covered his face with his hands, began to cry too. For one of the first times in his life, he cried his heart out. The two men sat there like lost children, filling the hut with their shared pain, tears, and sharing their stories of loss. But after a time, the tears ceased, and all was quiet. They prayed for one another. Then the rabbi lifted his head. You and your community are serving God with heavy hearts. I know why you have come today. You have come to ask a teaching of me, and I will give you one. But you may only repeat it once, and after that Not you or anyone else may ever say it aloud again." The rabbi looked straight at the pastor and said, "The Messiah is among you." For a while, all was silent. And then the rabbi said, "Now you must go." And the pastor left without a word, without ever looking back. The next morning, the pastor called his clergy team together in the conference room. He told them that he had received a teaching from the rabbi who walks in the woods, and that teaching which he was about to share with them must never again be spoken aloud. It could only be shared this one time. Then he looked at the group and said, "The rabbi said that one of us is the Messiah." The pastors were startled by this. They asked themselves, what could it mean? They asked themselves, is it Brother John? Is he the Messiah? Or is it Sister Mary or Brother Thomas? Am I the Messiah? What could all of this mean? They were deeply puzzled by the rabbi's teaching, but no one ever mentioned it again, just as they had been instructed. As time went by, the pastors began to treat one another with a new and special reverence. A gentle, warm-hearted concern began to grow among them, one that was hard to describe with words, but easy to see. They began to live with each other as people who had finally found the special something they were looking for. Yet they always read the scriptures together as a people who were always looking for something else. When visitors came to the church, they found themselves deeply moved by the life of these pastors, and word spread. And before long, people were coming from far and wide to be nourished by the prayer life of the church and to experience the loving reverence that each one held for the other. Soon other young men and women were asking once again to be part of the community. And the community grew and prospered. It was never quite like it was, but it was good. Then the days came when the rabbi no longer walked in the woods. His hut fell into ruins, and yet somehow the old pastors had taken his teachings to heart, still felt sustained by its prayerful presence. Being a servant of God requires no special training. It requires no uncommon gifts, no economic level, no home ownership. It requires nothing. It asks us to be ourselves. It asks us to be vulnerable to one another. Being a servant asks us to look, to care for others in the deep and meaningful ways. To look past who society says they are and embrace them as children of God. To treat all humanity as if they were the Messiah. Amen. Our hymn will also find in the Elias book.